Welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Ingrao. This is Beekeeping Equipment, Tools of the Trade. And in this lecture, what we're going to do is discuss the basic beekeeping tools that we use in the industry, and we'll discuss the Langstroth hive in depth and all the components of that hive. Now, the reason we focus on the Langstroth hive is because that is the industry standard here in the United States. There are alternative hives, but we will not discuss those in this lecture. So let's move forward with the tools that we use in the industry. So when I started in beekeeping, my mentor nearly 20 years ago had a mantra: hive tool, smoker, and veil. And those are the three basic tools that you need to work with bees. Now, each one of these has their own function, and we're going to talk about those functions here in the next few slides. But I want to impress upon you that these are the basic tools that you need to successfully keep bees and keep yourself protected. Now, the reason that we use these materials is because we're trying to protect ourselves, like I said, but also these tools help us also protect bees by handling them appropriately. So let's talk about these tools. Let's start with the hive tool. So the hive tool is a tool that we use to basically move through a beehive. We use the tools to break propolis seals like the boxes, the frames that are propolized together, and it allows us to break these seals and move frames around easily. Now, the idea behind the Langstroth hive is that the frames are modular, so we move these one at a time, and that's where the tool comes in. Now, these are the three basic hive tools that we have in the industry. Starting from the left, we have the standard hive tool. The second hive tool we have in the center there is the J-hook tool. And then the last one I have pictured here is the Kent-Williams tool. Now, there are different tools in addition to these as well. There's lots of different styles out there, but these are the three basic tools that we use in the industry. And I'm going to talk about the functionality of each one of these here briefly. So we'll start with the standard hive tool. The front of the standard hive tool, you see there is a sharp end, and that end is used for breaking propolis seals, so breaking those seals between the boxes or between the top cover and the inner cover, or between the inner cover and the top box, or between frames. So that front end is used for those types of activities. In addition, those sharp ends are also used for scraping surfaces. So burr comb that you have that may be upon the tops or bottoms of your frames, that's what we use to scrape it. Now, with the standard hive tool, you see that there's this hook end on the back as well. Now, the hook end is specifically used for breaking frames apart, breaking the seals on frames apart. And the way that you do that is you take that hooked end there, you put it in between the frames near the end. You see I'm approaching that area with the hive tool I have in my hand there. You put it near the end, not between the two pieces that make bee space, those two frame ends. You see those joining pieces there? That is the actual piece that makes your bee space between your frames. You don't want to go in between there, but you go in just next to that. You put that hooked end in, and then you turn the hive tool, and it breaks the seals without damaging your frames. Now, the second tool that we have here, the J-hook tool, a little bit different design, but it's kind of the same concepts. You have a sharp end again for breaking propolis seals and scraping, but you see that there's no hook end here like you have on the back there, that large hook. Instead, you have this small hook that is oriented in a different direction. And the way that that works is that this is used for helping you pop the frames out. So you use the front end to break those seals apart, and then you see this little, you see this little ledge here. That little ledge right there is used to actually do the same thing that we did on the back end of the standard tool. So we set that ledge in right next to where those two frames meet. We're setting it right down to the inside of that. So you set the blade in, and then you turn it with that ledge being faced down into the frames. Now, once you get those propolis seals broken, then you take that J-hook and you put it on the outside of where those two frames meet, right here next to the hive body. You stick that in there, and then that little ledge sits on the opposing frame, and you actually use that opposing frame as leverage to pick that frame up and out. Now, that's really nice because you can get your fingers underneath there and get those frames out real easily. That is not a feature the standard hive tool has. So it's a little bit of an added bonus to be able to help you get those frames out. Now, the J-hook tool, the one in the center here, this is the tool that I've been using for over a decade, and it is my preferred hive tool. But when it comes down to hive tools, it's all going to be preference. Now, the difference between these two and the Kent Williams Hive tool, well, you can probably figure that out. It's a combination of the two. And so you get all the features of both Hive tools in a single Hive tool. But this is a tool you are going to have to have. And I impress upon you that you need to buy a couple of these. They're, very inexpensive, around $10, but you need to have a couple of these because invariably, during the season, you're going to be walking around your bee yard. Something's going to fall. One of these is going to fall out of your pocket, or you're going to set it down. You're going to forget it. These things get lost in the grass very easily, especially if you have tall grass around. And so you want to have a couple of these around because these are necessary tools to work a beehive. So that's your first tool, is the Hive tool. The second one is the smoker. Now, the smoker is something that we have had in the beekeeping industry since the beginning. And we're talking 4,500 years ago in ancient Egypt, they would use piles of smoldering dung when they were working bees. Now, one of the things about working with a smoker, you do not want to overuse a smoker. And so you see this picture I have here. This is me showing what I would say not to do, which is smoking a hive before you even enter it. The response to smoke by honeybees, although we in the industry oftentimes say it calms the bees, that's from our perspective. It calms the bees because it basically dilutes alarm pheromone because you're introducing smoke into an area where there may be alarm pheromone. So if you get a hive that starts to kick off and starts, bopping your veil and letting you know that they're getting a little testy, that's when you're going to use a little bit of smoke, and you're just going to use a little bit of it. It dilutes the alarm pheromone. It also clogs the antennae, the chemoreceptors on the antennae, so it makes it hard for them to interpret the alarm signals as well. In addition, it also puts a response on them where they basically are getting ready to evacuate. So again, this is a stress response when they get hit with smoke, but we always kind of say it calms them down, but that's from our perspective. And so we don't want to overuse smoke because it is a stress response. That secondary stress response that we see is the bees dive down into the colony, they gorge themselves with honey in preparation to evacuate the hive. Now, that doesn't seem like a very calming experience to me. So that is something that you need to relate to yourself as well. If I were in a forest fire, a fire coming towards my house, am I going to be relaxed and calm? No, you're going to be basically gathering everything you can in order to evacuate. That is not a calming situation. But from our perspective, it does calm the bees down. So you should only be using smoke when the bees are telling you that they're getting a little spicy. Otherwise, and I'll be real honest, like during the middle of the season, July, August, I rarely touch a smoker. I'll always have it lit and going, but the idea here is that you only need to use it when necessary. And that's when the bees start to get a little aggressive. You'll introduce a little bit of smoke to calm that situation down, again, from our perspective. But the smoker is, again, a very important tool. You should always have it with you. It should always be going. But again, you are probably not going to use it very much. And that's part of good hive handling, is not being tough on your bees, which then in turn creates a little more of a gentle interaction with them from both perspectives as well. The veil, a very important piece of equipment as well. Now, there's many different styles of veils, and you see three styles here. So we have just the face veil. This is my wife Lacey here, who's filling up a feeding reservoir here for bees. You see, she just has a face veil on and just a t-shirt and gloves. Now, that is totally fine. During a lot of the season when bees are calm and not really aggressive, that's a perfectly fine thing to wear. A lot of times I'll go out in July working bees in just a t-shirt and a face veil. And it's very comfortable from both the heat perspective and the protection perspective because you only have your face protected. Now, the face is what we want to protect. You're going to get stung in your hands. You're going to get stung in your arms. You're going to get stung in all sorts of places as a beekeeper. But the face is where you want to protect because it's not fun to get stung in the face. I've been stung all over, but I'll tell you the worst ones are near the eyes, in the nose, near the mouth, in the ears. These are really not fun places to get stung. And so you want to protect your face. You'll see some folks that don't wear veils at all, and that is a total personal preference. But let me just kind of set a little bit of perspective for you. You're working beehives and you have a heavy honey super. Say it's totally full. You got 50 pounds of honey in your hand in a super, and you're not wearing a veil. And a bee just so happens to just fly by and just go up your nose. As soon as they get up your nose, they are going to sting you because they get trapped, and the first response they have is to sting when they get in those situations. You may have been handling the bees just fine. This could have just been incidental. Maybe you just happened to inhale it as a bee was flying by. But that response of you getting stung when you're carrying a bunch of bees in your hand with a heavy box, that becomes a very dangerous situation, both for you as an individual. But if you drop that box and that beehive explodes and you don't have a veil on, you are going to get attacked ferociously in that situation. So a veil is something you need to be wearing no matter what. That is my professional opinion on that. Again, you will see people who don't wear veils. I do not advise that ever for anyone, no matter what their level of experience is. I've been doing this for 20 years, and that is not something that I do. I'm fine with just a face veil, but your face needs to be protected for you and for the bees. The next one you see here is a jacketed veil. So this is a veil that includes a jacket and has a veil as well. Many different styles of these available. And then you see the full coveralls here as well. Now, the thing about coveralls, jackets, and veils, they all have their different purpose. As bees get a little spicy as we go into robbing season, which is in the fall, you are going to have bees that are much more aggressive in, say, September than they were in July. That's just the nature of bees that time of the year. And so having a full jacket that time of the year, I wear a full jacket in the fall because I just don't want to get stung all the time. Again, you're going to get stung as a beekeeper, but you want to minimize those interactions because again, you're working bees and getting stung. You may drop a frame, you may trip over because you got stung. It's important to keep yourself safe. Now, you see the different face veils here. You see that we have this like safari hat style, we have this like wide brim style, and then the fencer veil or the English veil. This again is total personal preference, what style of veil you want. You're going to probably go through a few of them over your beekeeping career. You see that we've had, in our apiary, we use all of them for different reasons. The one I will say that I'm not a real big fan of is this wide brim veil. And the reason is because when you bend over into a hive, unless you have a chin strap on it, that veil falls forward off of your head and gets in your way. I'm a big fan of the fencer veil, and that's what my veils, all of my veils are, is this style of veil over here. Now, when it comes to coveralls, many of you probably brand new to beekeeping, never kept bees before. One of the things that you need to realize is that when you're keeping bees, you want to feel safe as a beginner. You don't want to be sketchy and constantly thinking about bees getting in your veil or stinging you or things like that. It's important that you feel comfortable because you're going to handle the bees better if you feel comfortable and safe. So if it means you need full coveralls when you first get started, that is totally fine. Feel free to wear that. They are kind of warm. I'll be real honest about that, but they also do make ventilated suits nowadays. So you can get ventilated jackets and ventilated full coveralls as well, which help with that heat as well. But if you're wearing full coveralls, Lacey, my wife, a lot of times when she's working in the bee yard during the summer and she decides she wants to wear full coveralls, it's because she wears a bathing suit underneath. So, you can accommodate those hotter suits with, less clothing underneath. But again, this is all personal preference, but the big thing is you want to feel protected and you want to feel safe. As you go on in your beekeeping career, maybe you go down to just a face veil. But if you need to have full coveralls to feel safe, please wear those. All right, the next thing I'm going to talk about are gloves. And gloves, again, gloves are an important part of PPE, but they are totally optional, which is why they're not part of the mantra of Hive Tool Smoker and Veils. They are totally optional. Well, let's talk about the series of gloves that we use in the industry and why you would use one over another. So let's talk about the one right here on the left. You see that this is me and a student of mine, and that student is wearing full leather beekeeping gloves. Those are the beekeeping gloves that you buy from beekeeping supply companies and things like that. Generally, every beekeeper I've ever met, this is one of the first things that they get are gloves, and you tend to have those gloves for a really long time. Now, one of the things about these gloves is they do offer maximum protection. So you are protected, and that's, again, important as a beginner that you feel protected and safe because it's going to improve your hive handling skills where you're not going to be so worried about like a bee getting under your finger or something like that, which is something that we learn as we go into beekeeping and start to practice and advance our hive handling skills. But this is something that everybody has, and it's something that most people start with. The thing about it, although it provides maximum protection, most people buy one pair of these gloves, and it's the same pair of gloves that they wear every time they work their bees. These gloves can serve as reservoirs for pathogens. So things like American foul brood, the spores of American foul brood can get on these gloves if you handle a diseased hive, and they stay on the gloves. And so you have the ability to actually pass pathogens to other colonies that you're working after you work that diseased hive. This is the major drawback of these gloves, is that they are constantly being used over and over again, hive to hive, and you're just passing things from one hive to another. So that's one big drawback of those gloves. This is why I really advise, as people kind of move into their beekeeping career, to transition from those gloves to nitrile gloves. Now, the thing that I want to impress upon you with the leather gloves is you have very little dexterity. And dexterity is very important with beekeeping because you want to be able to feel the bees under your fingers. You don't want to just be smashing bees all the time when you're picking up frames. You want to be able to pick those frames up, feel the bees, move them out of the way with your fingers, and move on. The less bees you crush, the less agitated your hive is going to get, because every time you crush those bees, it's going to set off some alarm pheromone. So the dexterity is really important, and you don't get those with leather gloves. But the nitrile gloves, they do offer maximum dexterity. They also offer a little bit of protection. Now, bees will sting through these. If you smash a bee with a nitrile glove on, you will get stung. But the bees don't recognize the surface as a surface that they would sting. So bees will land on your hands, they'll move around on your hands, but they won't readily sting your hands. Only usually if you are the one who causes the sting by crushing bees. Now, the other thing, and the real positive about these, and the reason that I prefer wearing these types of gloves all the time, and has nothing to do with protection, because like I said, you will get stung through these. What I wear nitrile gloves for specifically is working with diseased hives. So you're moving through an apiary. You've got, excuse me. So you're moving through an apiary. You've got a dozen hives in this apiary. On hive number 6, you find out halfway through your inspection that, hey, this hive has American foul brood. Now, if that's the situation, if you interact with a diseased hive in an apiary that you're working through multiple hives, if you had the leather gloves, you're just going to keep working through those hives. But with the nitrile gloves, as soon as I work a hive that has any sort of disease, after I am done with that hive, I take those nitrile gloves off, I dispose of them, I put fresh gloves on, and I disinfect my hive tool with a 10% bleach and water solution to make sure that nothing passes from hive to hive. This is really important hygienic practices for us, and sanitation practices for us as beekeepers. So that is the big advantage of nitrile gloves, is the ability to work diseased hives and be able to get that disease away from you by disposing those gloves before you move on to another hive. Now, the last iteration of this is gloveless, and that is something I did for a very long time, a decade probably, is working gloveless. Gloveless is fine. You will get stung. It is maximum dexterity. However, working a lot of beehives, your hands are going to get covered in propolis and wax and honey, and you just get really sticky over time. That's another big advantage of the nitrile gloves, is once the gloves just get too sticky, you just take them off and replace them. But with your hands, you're going to have to sanitize those. Now, if you interact with a diseased colony, you're going to have to sanitize your hands after you work that diseased colony. Again, this is a maximum dexterity, but there are some drawbacks because you don't have that ability to just dispose the gloves right away. My preference, nitrile gloves. But for those of you who want to go gloveless, it's a really nice way to interact with your bees. And I still do gloveless sometimes. I just don't generally do it when I'm doing large-scale inspections on a lot of colonies. I'll probably do it if I just want to pop into one colony and see what's going on, or maybe I had a queen situation going on and I needed to check on. That's when I would probably go gloveless. But if I'm working any number of hives, I'm always wearing gloves because of that sanitation factor. Okay, so that is our basic equipment for us as individuals to work bees. Now let's talk about the modern beehive here. So in the United States, the hive that we use industry-wide is the Langstroth hive. This hive was developed in 1851 and patented in 1852 by Lorenzo Langstroth. Lorenzo Langstroth actually was the individual who was credited with understanding bee space. So what he observed in 1851 was that no matter what space he gave the bees, they would always narrow it down to about 3/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch. And that's what we call bee space. And so what he incorporated into this modular hive design that he developed in 1852 was bee space. And what that is bee space is the space that's wide enough for two bees to pass without colliding. So on your frames, we look at this top shot here of these frames. That space that is made by those little tabs, those wooden tabs at the end of your frames where the two frames come together, Those tabs are responsible for creating bee space. And so that's what you see in between these frames. If you don't space your frames when you're done with a colony, meaning you push them all to the middle and make sure they're spaced appropriately, those big gaps, they'll just create comb there to create a smaller gap. They're always going to move those larger gaps down to bee space. So that's what this is really was revolutionary about this hive style at this time. Now, the reason that we're focusing on the Langstroth hive is because it is the industry standard in the US. No matter where you're working with bees, you are going to interact with a Langstroth hive. Now, there are alternative hives. Those are hives that you need to take a look at a little deeper. There are lots of different alternative hives. Each one has their own management differences, but we're going to stick with this one, at least for this talk here, to make sure that you understand the fundamentals of what the hive is that's our industry standard. Again, there are multiple other alternative hives, and those are something that you should explore as a beekeeper. But this is what you're going to be introduced to. This is where what most equipment is going to be available to you in the Langstroth style. Even alternative hives, like many of you have probably heard of the Flow hive, that is a Langstroth hive. It just has a kind of a proprietary super that they use for honey extraction. But other than that, it's exactly the same as a standard Langstroth hive. But that's our industry standard. So let's go through it piece by piece so you fully understand which each one of these components are on this beehive. All right, so let's start at the bottom with the hive stand. The hive stand is basically the bottom piece of your hive. You do not set your bottom board directly on the ground because of moisture and pests. And moisture and pests will destroy a hive that sit directly on the ground. And so instead, we use hive stands of all sorts in styles. So you see the picture here. This is one that you can purchase or make, which is just a basic wooden hive stand. You see this one uses cinder blocks or posts that you would use for like a decking or something like that. Or you can do something as basic as a pallet. I've used pallets for many years. The commercial industry, all of their hives are palletized. And so that's what you're basically looking for. In my apiary, with the stuff that's not palletized, most everything is on 2 cinder blocks. And the reason I use 2 cinder blocks is because they're $1 a piece. It's a very inexpensive hive stand, especially if you have 100+ colonies like we do. Those hive stands can get very expensive. I mean, you can buy these from a manufacturer for $20 to $50, or you can just make your own. The bees don't care what kind of stand they're on. You just need them elevated so that they're away from pests and predators. And depending on the pests and predators that you're dealing with, you may need to make alterations to the hive stand in order to protect your bees. So like an example, ants are a big example of a pest that gets into beehives, and they basically crawl up the hive stand. What you could do in a situation like that, say we're using this wooden hive stand here, I could put what we call tanglefoot, which is a sticky substance used in pest management in the agriculture industry. We primarily use it on trees for pests that crawl up tree trunks. You can put tanglefoot around all of those feet right there, and it will catch every single ant that comes up that stand. So there's things that you can do to change things. Say you have larger predators like raccoons or skunks. Maybe you need to get the hive stand a little higher than say like 8 inches off the ground. These are things that you can alter as you get to know your area and the pests and predators that you're dealing with in your area. But that's a hive stand. Now, the first piece of our beekeeping equipment, the first piece of the hive itself, is the bottom board. Now, the bottom board is where bees come in and out from. It is also basically the bottom portion of your colony. So this is basically where your colony is interacting and moving in and out. So this is where all your foragers are going to come in and out of. It's where your guard bees are going to be. It's where your big entrance is. Now, there's 2 styles of bottom boards. There are solid bottom boards, which you see on the top here, and screen bottom boards, which you see on the bottom there. Now, here's the thing. Bottom boards. When the screen bottom boards first came out, and it's probably been 20 years now that they've been out on the market, the idea here is these were an IPM tool, an integrated pest management tool for Varroa, meaning we believed that when Varroa fell off of the bees and onto the bottom board, they'd go through the screen and couldn't get back up. Now, what we learned over the years of research is that's really not the case. They don't really do a great job of any kind of management of pests as far as actually having an impact on the control control of them. But what it is really nice for is for mite drop. So after you do a treatment, you say you pull your bottom board out, and before you do the treatment, you clean it off, you put it back in, you do a treatment, and then you see the mite drop. Now, the mite drop you see is just a visual representation of how many mites came off. There is no way to quantify your mite count based on mite drop with a screen bottom board. There's no way, because you have no standardized count. You don't know how many bees those mites came off of to make any sort of correlation to the amount of mites per the number of bees. So it's a totally useless tool for determining mite counts, but it can give you a relative feeling of like how effective your treatment was by how many mites have dropped off. The other thing it works well for is in winter climates, it can work well for moisture. Your bees will put off a lot of moisture in the form of respiration during the winter that condenses in the beehive and runs down the beehive and out the front. Generally, with the screen bottom board, you have an area for that to come out in addition to the front of the hive as well. But the bees don't care. And to be quite honest, it's a lot cheaper to buy solid bottom boards than screen bottom boards, but it is total preference. But I will tell you, you are not going to get any pest management benefits out of a screen bottom board, even though there's a lot of old literature that says that. So make sure you're reading the most current literature when you're looking at these types of, innovations in beekeeping as well. Entrance reducer, this is just to reduce your entrance. So we have two different sizes on this. We have the small opening and the medium opening. Depending on the time of the year, you're going to move this entrance opening. So during the season, when bees are plentiful and food is plentiful, you're going to have the bottom board wide open. As the season starts to wane and bees start to get defensive because of robbing behaviors, and they're trying to keep all of that honey secure at the end of the season, you're going to reduce this down to the medium entrance or even the smallest entrance. The way you need to think about the entrance reducer is its defensible position. So the smaller the opening, the easier it is to defend that position. The larger it is, the harder it's to defend. So what we're trying to do is, as the colonies become subject to potential robbing at the end of the season, we want to reduce that defensible position so that the bees have a better chance to defend the colony. In the winter, I move this all the way to the small entrance because you really don't need a lot of airflow coming in through the winter in the form of overwintering practices that we practice. So that's the entrance reducer. It's basically just to reduce that defensible position in the entrance. The next one are your hive bodies. Now, hive bodies come in deep, medium, and shallow sizes. So 9 and 5/8, 6 and 5/8 in height, and 5 and 11/16 in height are the heights of your hive bodies. It does not matter what size hive bodies you use. The bees do not care. But the standard kind of orientation in the industry, and this is not something you have to follow, is deep hive bodies for the brood chamber and medium hive bodies for the honey supers. Now, the big thing about deep hive bodies is that they are deep, so they weigh more. If you're an individual that's dealing with disabilities or you're working with individuals with disabilities, deep hive bodies are tough to move, especially when they're 10-frame equipment. With the hive bodies, you have a choice. You can do 8-frame equipment or 10-frame equipment. If you're dealing with limitations, 8-frame equipment is absolutely the way you should be going. You shouldn't even be messing with 10-frame equipment. And if you are dealing with limitations, physical limitations of lifting or things like that, medium hive bodies for all of the boxes works just fine. And that is a recommendation we make a lot to the students that go through our programming. So make sure that you understand that although this is the industry standard, and that's what this diagram says, you do have the option to use smaller hive bodies for working both the brood chamber and the honey chamber. But the hive bodies are basically where your frames live. That's what they're for, is to keep your frames in place. The queen excluder is what can be used above the brood chamber. So you see we have two brood boxes here, those deep boxes. Your brood boxes are always going to be on the bottom of the hive. That's where you're going to maintain that brood chamber, and then honey stores go on the top of that. Now, the reason that a lot of people like to use queen excluders is because by putting a queen excluder in that position, you basically keep the queen in the bottom two boxes. And that's nice because, you make sure that she's not laying any brood above. However, many of us don't use queen excluders at all, myself included. And the reason is because most of the time, except in the beginning of the season when we have spring buildup and the queen's just laying like gangbusters, most of the time you do not get a lot of brood above the brood chambers. The normal size that we see brood is usually about 2 basketballs if you stacked them on top of one another. That's about the size that your queen is going to maintain the brood chamber. Every once in a while, you'll get a queen that wanders and she'll move up into the boxes and lay some eggs, but it's not normal. So you do not have to use a queen excluder. This is a totally optional piece of equipment, and many of us have been doing this for a very long time. This is just an extraneous piece of equipment for us. So a lot of us don't use it. But again, if you're new and you want to make sure you know where your queen's at, this is a great way to make sure you know which boxes she's in, and you can keep her sequestered below, and you just make sure that you get honey above, which is totally fine and what that is intended for. The next one is honey supers. So like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't matter what size box you use, whether it's deep, medium, or shallow for honey supers. The idea is that honey is always going to be stored above. This is the natural orientation that bees are going to orient brood, and honey is brood below, honey above. And so those are what your honey supers are. Now, when we use the term honey super, that's a general term. You can use that term for mediums, deeps, or shallows. It just connotates that these are the boxes that you're storing honey in. All right, so those are our honey supers. Next are the frames. The frames are what your bees are going to build comb on and are going to basically store everything in. The big thing to know about frames is there's many different styles of frames. There's wooden frames and plastic frames. So that's what you see here. This top one is a wooden frame. This one down here is a totally plastic frame, meaning that all aspects of the frame are plastic. Now, with wooden frames, you have an option. You can do beeswax as your foundation, and the foundation is what is in the middle of the frame, which bees use as a starting point to build combs out on. So this is a normal piece of beekeeping equipment. But if you want to maintain the continuity of all beeswax in your colony, you can use beeswax foundation. Beeswax foundation is a little different than plastic foundation because it's wired into the frame. So it takes a little longer to mount. You also generally have to wire cross wires in, or excuse me, iron cross wires into the frame as well to create enough rigidity so that when you spin these out in an extractor, the frames don't blow out completely. So wax foundation, fantastic. You know, it's what most people are using across the globe. But here in the United States, a lot of us use plastic foundation. And the reason is because of the rigidity. Plastic foundation can be an insert just like this wax foundation you see here and just popped right into a wooden frame. That's what I use, is plastic foundation with wooden frames. And when you're using plastic foundation, the thing you want to keep in mind is that it needs to have wax on it. You can't just put in bare plastic foundation and expect bees to draw it. You need to have a lot of wax on this. So what I recommend to my students is that when you are buying plastic foundation, make sure you're getting double or triple waxed foundation. And there's a lot of companies that make these out there. So just make sure you're getting the right thing. Now, the next thing to keep in mind too is timing, right? So if you are doing a lot of frames and you're making these on your own, plastic foundation is very time effective because you just pop it in. You don't have to wire it in like beeswax foundation. Now, the alternative to this is a total plastic foundation. A lot of companies make this, like Acorn. They're just a totally plastic frame. So they come ready-made. You don't have to do anything with them. You just pop them in the colony and they're ready to go. You can also buy the wooden frames as well, totally assembled as well. But it's just a simplified version. A lot of people like these plastic foundations. I'm not a big fan of them. They tend to break pretty often and they're tough to repair. The wood frames, you can actually repair them. If, say, like the rabbit ear breaks off or something like that, you can actually repair those. So the two types of frames that you have available to you. It's all personal preference, but the rigidity of the plastic foundation is really nice because when you put it in an extractor, you can spin that extractor very quickly and the frames never blow out. Sometimes you get that with wax foundation, especially if they're not properly wired in. They can blow out in an extractor, meaning that the whole inside foundation portion just comes out. It creates a mess in an extractor. So just the things to consider. Now, above your frames and your hive bodies is your inner cover. The inner cover is what is between the top box and your outer cover. Now, inner covers are optional. Inner covers are typically only used with telescoping covers, which is what we have pictured here, which are the covers that basically the hive kind of telescopes into. So they're the ones that kind of fit over the hive a little bit. These basically are used, inner covers are basically used to help with the whole propolis thing. So when you have a telescoping cover that's right down on top of your hive bodies without an inner cover, they're going to propolize that all together. And sometimes those can be really difficult to get up because of the lip that you have that's covering the outer portion of the hive body. So sometimes that can be difficult, and that's why the inner cover is there, is to reduce the amount of propolization on the outer cover, on a telescoping outer cover. Now, with outer covers, the thing about outer covers, telescoping covers and migratory covers. The telescoping cover you're going to use with an inner cover, like we had just shown previously. But a lot of folks will use what we call migratory covers, which take lots of different shapes and forms, but most of the time it's just a piece of marine grade plywood that we put on top of the colony. The bees don't care how fancy your outer cover is. They really could care less. They just want to make sure that you're not getting water infiltration into the colony itself. So a piece of marine grade plywood works just fine as a top cover. I have probably 50 hives that have just a marine grade top cover that is just, like I said, marine grade plywood that's just cut to size. Very inexpensive to make. You can do a whole lot of them very quickly with a table saw. But if you are, wanting to have the telescoping cover, that is kind of what, is kind of most hobbyists are using when they buy their beekeeping equipment as a telescoping cover. It's nice because the metal outside actually prevents, the weather from getting in at any point. The drawback of telescoping covers, the only drawback I'll say is they're more expensive, but the other one is that if you are using a ventilated hive suit or a jacket or a full coverall, the nails on these do work out over time, these little nails across the top cover, and they will get hung up on your suit. It's the number one reason why I have to replace my suits every 2 years. I work a lot of our colonies, but I also work all sorts of customer colonies, and most people are using these. But invariably, every time I go out to a customer's hive that's got one of these on there, the nails are starting to back out. It gets caught on my stomach when I'm lifting the cover up, and invariably I put holes in my suit with the telescoping covers. But again, these are all personal preference, right? All right, so let's get into feeders. So feeders are something you're going to need as part of your beekeeping equipment. We feed bees during times when resources are scarce or when bees are light on resources going into winter, and we need to bulk up the resources that they have so that they have enough food to get through winter. I'm going to talk about a few types of feeders here. Not the whole gamut of them. There's a lot of different fancy feeders out there nowadays, but these are the basics. So the first one is the Boardman feeder. This is the one that pretty much every beginning beekeeping kit you're going to buy is going to have with it. This is the feeder that's positioned on the front. It basically slides into the front entrance, and then you have a reservoir that's a mason jar that you use for feeding the bees. Now, the thing about the reservoir, the nice thing about this is you can see how fast the bees go through liquid feed, and I will tell you a quart mason jar may last you a day or two. So it's not you don't need that to actually have a lot of input on how much your bees are feeding on. They feed through this stuff very quickly when it's available. The problem with Boardman feeders is what you see in this picture right here, which is you get a lot of robbing when it comes to a Boardman feeder. You see this cluster of bees has gathered right on the outside, right outside of this, and are literally funneling right into the front entrance. When you have this available, it basically is a food resource that's very easy to get to. This colony is not going to be able to guard that entire entrance with this feeder in there. And so what you end up getting is a lot of scavenging from bees that don't belong to this colony, and they're taking your feed for you and bringing it somewhere else. Maybe it's a neighbor's colony. So the drawback of the Boardman feeder is it can actually create a robbing situation, and that's not a good thing. So most of the time, we do not want to use feeders that are mounted to the outside of a colony. We want them mounted on the inside where the bees that are only part of that colony have access to that feeder. That's where top feeders come in, and these come in many different styles that you see here. So the top feeders, the way they basically work is it's a reservoir. So you see Lacey here filling up these reservoirs. It's about 2.5 gallons of feed that these reservoirs will hold. The way that this works is the bees, this is mounted right on top of your colony. The bees come up through the center, and so they come up through the center, and then they use this lattice to basically walk on. Now, there's many different versions of this. There's some that the middle has a hardware cloth on it, so the bees crawl on the hardware cloth and just feed from there. But this one in particular, they walk on these lattices. Now, the reason there's lattices and the reason there's walking things to climb on with bees and liquid is because bees are terrible swimmers. And if you don't have something for them to climb on, they're just going to drown. So that's your top feeder. Nice because the bees in the colony are the only ones that have access. Cap and ladder feeders or frame feeders, these are widely available, mostly used in the commercial industry, but also, great to be used in by any hobbyist or sideliner. The way that these work is they take the position of one or two frames. You mount these on the outside of your hive bodies, usually in a brood chamber. And what you have here is that you have this reservoir, usually a gallon or two of feed, and then you have this top piece, which is the cap and ladder piece, which has these ladders that go down into the feed. So the bees just walk down those ladders, feed on the feed that's in the reservoir, and then come back out into the colony through these openings at the top. Cap and ladder feeder. Again, this is something that's very inexpensive to purchase and is widely available. The nice thing about this is the commercial guys use this because they can just basically open up a colony, take off the cap and ladder part, and then just fill the reservoir very quickly. So something to keep in mind, but that is what the industry uses primarily in the commercial industry. But again, a lot of hobbyists use these as well. Top feeders in the form of bucket feeders also work really well. You can buy these from bee supply companies like Man Lake or Better Bee, but you can also make these yourself. But basically the idea here is, and this is with the box taken away, but you see how this is the inner cover right here? So basically you take that inner cover, put it on your top box, and then you're going to put that reservoir right on top of that. Now this has a very fine mesh screen that is on the bottom, or I guess on the lid portion of that. And so when you flip this over, it creates a vacuum. The big thing about feeders, especially top feeders, the ones that are inverted, is it has to hold vacuum. If it doesn't hold vacuum and it's just dripping readily, you're just going to soak your bees. So if you do make these, you need to make sure that they hold vacuum. But again, you can purchase these. And the nice thing about these reservoirs is that nobody else can get to them, and they're very high capacity. So you can put a 2-gallon feeder on. That's going to last you maybe a week or more between having to fill that up. So you get a lot more time out of it. If you have out apiaries that aren't near your home, this is definitely the direction you want to go. Now, the way that you ensure that nobody else gets to that is that you see on the second picture here, you put a hive body around it. So you put on this case, you put the inner cover on, the feeder on, and then we would put a hive body around that, a deep hive body, and a lid so that it's also protected and you're not creating a robbing situation. Again, only the bees in the colony have access to that feeder. So those are your feeders. Really basic, but the big thing you want to keep in mind is that the internal feeder is the way you want to go. Otherwise, you have the potential of creating a robbing situation. All right, so we're going to wrap up this lecture today. Like I said earlier in the lecture, we're not going to discuss alternative hives. And the reason is because Langstroth is the industry standard in our country. But I do want to impress upon you that if you do want to look into our alternative hives, these are great hives. I have many alternative hives: Brummel hives, Long Lang hives, Kenyan top bar hives, Aja hives. I have all of these different hive styles in my apiary, but what I will tell you is every single one of them is managed differently. So if you are going to move into these alternative hive styles, make sure that you take an education course or get very familiar with them before you start working them, because management is very different than the Langstroth. But Langstroth is our industry standard, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture and learned a little bit about this type of equipment. And in future lectures, we're going to talk about exactly how to work this type of equipment appropriately so that you're keeping your bees and yourself safe. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll see you at the next lecture.